Welcome to the Geography of Crime, a podcast by Cap Index hosted by Dr. Grant Drawve, Vice President of Geospatial Crime Solutions. Crime doesn't happen in a vacuum. Place matters, and in each episode of this podcast, we'll explore how geography shapes crime risk across industries. With expert insights from criminologists, security professionals, and business leaders, we'll break down crime trends, analyze real-world data, and explore what drives risk in different places. Now, let's dive into today's episode.
Hey there, everyone. This is Grant Drawve, the host of the podcast Geography of Crime. Today, I have a special guest that I've followed her work for years, and I'm excited about the topics that we're getting in today, so I'll let her introduce herself. But Dr. Charlotte Gill, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on. I am Charlotte Gill. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. I study a range of things that are relevant to the topic of this podcast. I've done a lot of work around community policing, but that's kind of led into this broader interest in communities and place-based work. So I've done work around crime concentration, and I'm particularly interested in taking that out of the urban setting and looking at how some of those theories and empirical findings apply in suburban and rural areas too.
And that's what I'd love to hear, and we'll chat on that. As you mentioned, you're at George Mason. You have a lot of history and work in evaluation and evidence-based policy, be it place-based or more broadly. How did you become interested in that side of things?
My first job was as a research assistant on a randomized controlled trial of restorative justice with Professors Larry Sherman and Heather Strang in the UK. So I was fresh out of my master's program. One of the research managers was a PhD student in my department, and they were advertising for this position. And I thought, hey, I've got no plans after this. What should I do? And it looked really interesting. I had learned about restorative justice, and I was really interested in the area. So I remember going for the interview and just being so enthusiastic about it and telling them, oh my gosh, restorative justice, it's so cool. I think it's a great idea. And I remember Dr. Strang saying, we don't advocate for it, we test it. And I thought, oh gosh, that's great. I did not get this job. But I did. And it was such a fascinating experience and such a great entry point into being at the forefront of program evaluation and evidence-based policy, because we were actually running the restorative justice conferences. So I was doing all the prep work, going out with police officers who were facilitating the conferences to meet with the victims and the perpetrators and prepare them for the conversation, sitting in on the actual conferences themselves. They were face-to-face. So everybody was in the room together with their supporters, talking about the impact of the crime. We were taking notes, making tea, all that good stuff in the background. But it really showed me just the sort of real world impact of research and evidence-based policy. You know, it's not just, and believe me, there's a time and a place for sitting in your office reading books, but it was really cool to just be out there and meet real people who had been impacted by the system in different ways. And so that just really sort of developed a passion for field research, field experimentation, and just sort of being out there at the forefront rather than behind the scenes.
And I think you're describing a pivotal area there that still, I don't think gets enough attention. It's that translational part of the research to practice, practice to research, and you're living kind of both parts of that when you have a position like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then as you described it there, and it kind of piques my interest a bit of, you've worked heavily in policing, crime prevention over the years, be it evidence-based, and we're data-driven now more and more is the catchy title to it all. How's your perspective changed over the years as you first come in as a lovely RA to now faculty, many research projects later? How's your perspective shifted on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was kind of pondering this in the lead up to this conversation. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble as an evidence-based policy person. I'm still very much an evidence-based policy person. But I am just increasingly fascinated by the human experience and the stories behind the numbers. I would tentatively call myself a mixed methods researcher now, although I don't have a lot of formal training in qualitative approaches. But, you know, I still see the importance of the rigor behind the numbers and the statistics and that kind of thing. But I think that there's so much to be gained by getting out and talking to people and understanding their stories, whether they're community members, police officers, any area of the system, just learning how people have been impacted. So, I think I've evolved in that way too, into more of a sort of qualitative perspective. And then I think sort of in the substantive side, I've definitely become very interested in the role of really primary prevention, right? So how do we get ahead of these problems in the first place? And I think there's so much of that wrapped up in issues like community policing, place-based approaches, where we're not necessarily responding to crime so much as trying to be proactive and get ahead of it. And so I've become really interested in these kind of prevention and harm reduction approaches, as opposed to the law enforcement side of things. And then I think the third thing that I've really sort of evolved my thinking on is really sort of who has responsibility for which piece of the prevention process, right? I think we expect so much from our police officers, and they're not necessarily the experts in everything, and that's okay. I don't think they need to be. But there is nobody else that you can call at 2:00 in the morning, right? Other than the police. So I'm really interested in, and I think John Eck has done some really interesting writing on this, is one of the people who has, but just sort of what is the limit of police involvement and responsibility, and then what other expertise can we draw from to solve problems at places, whether it's community experience, local government, various services that might be provided. How can we improve collaboration and appreciation of the expertise of all of those different groups?
No, I love that. I think the qualitative part doesn't get enough attention in a lot of the data-driven discussions, but it gets at the why and the context of what the patterns you're seeing, the statistics you're seeing, but now you can connect it, and it provides a lot of context to it all. And I find it interesting with the community-based policing part, so I want to pick your brain a bit there of fully agree on police can't be everywhere at once, and many times they are reactive, because at 2 a.m., who else are you going to call, and who's going to answer, and who's going to show up?
Right.
You're reliant on them. Where have you seen strides as we think of different community stakeholders, that if we think more proactive, is it only the government and city agencies and that, but are there other avenues to go through when we think of stakeholders that have a stake in that game of we're trying to be preventative versus reactive? Have you found good ones that you've worked with over the years?
Yeah, I think it's maybe easier to engage groups that have kind of a formal structure, like a local government agency or that kind of thing. But I think that there's so much expertise that we overlook in communities themselves. I've done, for many years, I did community-based work in a neighborhood in Seattle, Rainier Beach, and I have a few papers based on that research. But one of the things that I noticed there is that there was so much turnover, so much transition, especially in the police department, but also in other government agencies. But you had community members who were in these hotspots that had been identified all the way back in David Weisberg's and colleagues' work from the early 2000s, right? And these hotspots had been 30-year locations of crime concentration. And you had these residents who had lived in these streets and grown up in these places for all of that time, right? And they had seen so many things. They were connected to all of these grassroots organizations. And I think sometimes we overlook that expertise. We have obviously the police and other government agencies, they have that training, they have that knowledge, but there are people who have just sort of seen the dynamics of a place change over time. The schools in those areas, and sort of how young people are being connected and sort of growing up and seeing their identity wrapped up within these places. I think that there's just so much to be learned from there. And then I think another area that I've seen some strides is in some work I've done around policing and mental health, and the challenges, but also I think the benefits of bringing in mental health professionals and that level of expertise to collaborate with the police. The police, again, are likely to be the ones that are called at 2 a.m., right? We don't have, unfortunately, a mental health crisis line that's accessible to everybody. It would be great if we did. But yeah, just having those partnerships, changing cultures to make those different groups more comfortable working together. I think that there's huge benefits there where we can say, okay, the police have this role where we want to make the situation safe. We want to make sure that everybody's secure. But now that we've done that, this person actually needs some kind of mental health or crisis assistant. Let's pass this over to the expert who's able to do that.
No, and that's spectacular. And I will say, I get to go to Seattle for my first time here in a couple months for the World Cup.
Oh.
But it's like, I read all this work on Seattle, and it's one of those, like, I think about like all the Philadelphia stuff with Taylor, Radcliffe, Groff, Seattle with Weisberg. So there's these cities that I haven't been to yet, Seattle being one of them, that is like, I just want to explore given what we know. And I think you bring up a good point there that doesn't get enough attention. If you do have residents, people that have lived in the community decades, so they have seen it change, they've seen it stay high crime or whatever it may be, but it's almost your anchor person to that neighborhood of they know who's connected and everything to it, to where you need the buy-in from the local communities as much as top down, you need bottom up with it. So it is very important to give that a voice. At the end of the day, you're trying to change their community. They need to be part of that process to buy in. So I think that's a very big point to highlight there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're the experts more than anybody. And I think we have to be very careful as researchers when we come in and sort of assume that we know what's best, right, based on what's worked somewhere else. I think that we can put those ideas out there. We can share our expertise in terms of data analysis and literature reviews and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, it has to be what makes sense for them. And if you have a community leader who, we were trying to address issues specifically around youth crime and youth victimization, right? And you have these community leaders who grew up in the neighborhood. They went to that high school. They know what it was like to be a kid in that neighborhood. Who am I to tell them what the best way is to deal with that situation? I think that they have a lot of knowledge. So we really worked in that project, and I collaborated with David Weisberg and others on that work. We sort of offered a broad framework. This gets to your point about translational work, right? We provided a broad framework of here are some things that we know generally are effective in responding to youth crime, things around collective efficacy, environmental changes at places, that kind of thing. But within that, we said, hey, community members, go off and figure out what makes most sense for you to do in your space within these very broad parameters, right? So what does collective efficacy look like here? What could you do to bring the community together and respond to these crime problems? And I think that was a really effective process in terms of engaging the community.
So I really like that. And before we jump from urban to rural, there is one question. So you're bringing up a good point. It talks about your past a little too, of how you got exposure to this area, kind of how you morphed into the researcher or scholar you are now. If you were to think back and give advice to students that want to work in this area, even younger faculty researchers itself, because there's an interesting intersection here of research, policy, and community. And it's very different to have that translational part to it. Is there any advice that you would give them as they navigate those waters? Because you said you're working with many different groups, turnover can be high, and you're also dealing with experts that have lived in that area with the lived experience for their entire lives. And you're an outsider coming in, which we all know is very difficult, let alone you want to look at data and talk numbers. It is an ivory tower, whatever you want to call it. But how do you approach that? And what advice, be it students or anyone else, that you would recommend for them?
Yeah, I think, I always advise my students, if they can at all, to get some kind of work experience or internship opportunity. And I know that's kind of fraught with challenges, especially in the current job market. But, when I have, for example, undergrads or master's students who say, I think I want to do a PhD and I don't know whether to go straight through or take some time out. I'm like, take some time out, go work in the real world and see what it's like. And I think that getting exposed to different experiences in different communities, especially early in your career, is so valuable, especially if you're not necessarily coming from that background yourself. I mean, I grew up in a very privileged environment. I didn't grow up around a lot of crime problems. I grew up in a safe neighborhood. And so being able to kind of understand the experiences of communities that are very different from what I was exposed to as a kid, it really just takes getting out there, being on the front lines of it, listening and asking a lot of questions. not sort of coming in again with that assumption that, oh, I read a lot of books and I think that you should do this, this, and this because the research says it works. But okay, yeah, just having some humility and not sort of going and assuming that you know what's right for that community, but sort of offering your perspective and balancing that with what the community is telling you about what they need.
And I don't think that can be underscored enough of you're an outsider coming in, so the humility of like, this is what I know, this is what I've read on, but you're the ones that live here. So it is giving them credit, giving them the voice, because at the end of the day, it's going to be more reliant probably on them to make any initiative work, get off the ground, and be sustainable. So it's that buy-in out of the gate. So I love that even from a student perspective of how to approach it. I even debate with myself when I talk to even my partner about it of, would I do it again differently? Because she went real world, then got a PhD. I went straight through, and I was like, I don't know if I could have gone back. But she had a very different take on it because she got to experience the world, the working world, and see that more reality of it all versus I've read 10 more articles. Here's what I think I know today. This is going to help me X, Y, and Z. So I do appreciate the experience angle a lot more. I think now, especially after leaving academia, that it's different in terms of the understanding of some of the problems that we talk about and write about versus people that are actively working in it and experiencing it themselves.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to, that first work experience that I had, right? That was in between my master's and PhD, and it was only a couple of years, but I think it was so life-changing just, again, to meet people who'd been impacted by the criminal justice system. And I remember one conference that we did where, again, this was in the UK, right? So I was making tea for everybody, and the perpetrator in this case, the guy who had pled guilty to the in this case a burglary offense, I think. I was talking to his partner, and she was the same age as me. We were both 22 at the time, and she was just talking very matter-of-factly about her life and how she'd been wrapped up in crime and underage sex work and all this kind of thing. And it was just so eye-opening to me to be face-to-face with somebody who was essentially a peer in age and experience and who had just had such a completely different life. And so I think that, that experience was very humbling for me. And I think that especially when you're an early career or a student, it may even be easier to sort of approach these situations with open-mindedness because you're not kind of stuck in your ways. You're not like,
Very
oh, hey,
so.
I'm an expert on this right now. It's a little bit easier, I think, to listen and take in other perspectives at that point. So I know that experience was really valuable for me. And I even if students are not able to take time out and work, I think if you're in your PhD program, seek out those professors who are doing work in collaboration with agencies or communities if you can. Get a chance to go out and work on a research project and collect some data or go to some community meetings and talk to people or just volunteer in the community. Are there crime prevention councils or my local area was doing a task force on homelessness recently and they had community member involvement. So anything like that where you can just go and listen and learn about what's going on in your community, I think is really valuable.
Oh, I love that advice. Now to pivot and turn to what you mentioned in your email, which I'm greatly looking forward to discussing, because as we think about crime in place, neighborhoods and crime, and kind of where it really developed and where most of the attention is focused on, it's big cities, metropolitan, urban areas, some suburban, but rural communities, when we think about this, has been a bit cast aside. Data access, police departments are usually sheriff departments, so access to it is very different. Working with it from an academic standpoint is also a little different if you think about the norms and cultural part to it. But what made you turn your attention to more rural communities? And the big part, what surprised you so far?
Okay, another story time. So this was entirely serendipitous, the way that I came to this. We had been working on the Seattle study, and that was it was funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and their own Criminal Justice Innovation Program, the BCJI, which was a community-led, data-driven, place-based approaches to crime prevention, developing, implementing, evaluating. And Seattle was one of the first sites. We were the first year that ever received one of these grants. And so I was connected in with the folks from BJA, doing various presentations and technical assistance and that kind of thing. And there was a university, an agency within a university in Kentucky, at Berea College at the time, who worked with young people, and they had come across this grant opportunity. And when their director read the grant opportunity, she said, "This is not written for us. It's all about street blocks and street segments and hotspots. And, it sounds very specific to urban areas. And I just cannot see a way to translate this." So as I understand it, she reached out to BJA and said, "Hey, can we talk about this? Because I really want to apply for this opportunity and I'm not seeing how it could be relevant to me. And that seems not right." And so BJA convened a meeting. They asked me to come and talk about the research on hotspots in rural areas. And I said yes. And then I got there and I said, "Well, I'm really not aware of any."
Great conversation.
Free lunch, I guess.
Yeah.
They had some other folks too who were experts in tribal crime prevention and other sort of related areas. But I got chatting to the director, Dreamer Gentry is her name, and she and I over lunch, we started talking about this, and I told her what we were doing in Seattle, and she said, "That's exactly the kind of thing I want to do." And I said, "Well, this grant application's due in 2 weeks. I think I can write it for a rural community, not that I know anything about that." And so we pulled the grant proposal together. I know, right? Nothing like staring down the barrel of a deadline. But we somehow put it together and we turned it in and we got funded, which was incredible. So we sort of took the model that we had developed in Seattle, which was the sort of community outreach, creating these task forces of community experts in hotspots to develop these youth crime prevention approaches. And we tried to sort of translate that to the rural setting. And for various reasons, the actual implementation part of that project didn't work out, but it was so eye-opening to travel to southeastern Kentucky. We were working specifically in 3 counties. It was Bell, Clay, and Harlan counties in southeastern Kentucky. So right down where Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee all meet up. Harlan County being famous for, coal mining and union wars and that kind of thing. So a completely different environment. There were no towns bigger than 10,000 people, if that. Definitely no street segments, just, small villages, the hollers, all that. And so we were trying to figure out sort of how do we make sense of this. So it ended up just being naturally a more qualitative approach because we just didn't have any kind of clear way of making sense of that unit of analysis. We did try to do the sort of traditional crime concentration at street segments maps. And we had some street segments that were 10 miles long.
Really?
Yep. Because, if you're counting sort of one intersection to the next and you're out in the country road, right? So that kind of threw us a little bit. So we had a bit of a challenge identifying our hotspots. A lot of the places where kids were getting together and crime was happening, they weren't places that you could intervene at in the same way that you might see in an urban space. So there's a lot of mountaintop removal coal mining in that area. So they'll sort of slice the top of the mountains off to get into the coal reserves. And a lot of these abandoned coal mines, kids will go up there and, take a dirt bike up there or something and drink and party and do what kids are going to do, right? How do you get law enforcement up there? How do you get programs or prevention approaches up there? You really don't. So it became more of a focus on how do we try and lure kids away from that and provide more opportunities. But again, in rural areas, there's so many challenges with that. You have to provide transportation and resources to get kids to places because you don't have a bus service. You may have a family that only has one car and they need that to get to work. And so how are you going to get the kids to the programs? There was only one sort of community center, Boys and Girls Club type place across all 3 of these counties.
Oh, wow.
So just the resources, the availability of the resources was so different. And And then from a data and research perspective, in addition to that sort of unit of analysis problem, just getting the data you mentioned earlier about police departments and sheriff's departments, there were 33 law enforcement agencies that we identified that served these various counties. So you had your town departments, which maybe had 3 officers. You had your sheriff's office. You had your state police. I don't even get me started on Kentucky constables. That's like a whole other area of law enforcement.
Oh, I believe that.
And I remember going into one police department and they were very keen to let us look at their data. We were so excited. And the officer points to a door and says, "It's in there in the filing cabinet." And it was literally paper files. So we eventually worked with a very wonderful police chief from one of the towns who was able to connect us in with the state police, who was sort of keeping an overview of what all the other police departments were reporting. So we were able to get that crime data in the end, but that was a journey in itself. It took us a considerable portion of our planning period just to figure out how we were going to get the information to figure out where the hotspots were. And so again, we kind of turned to qualitative approaches as well to understand from the community where they thought the hotspots were, because we were pretty sure that official information wasn't necessarily going to line up with where community members and kids in the community were actually experiencing crime.
Now that is, I mean, from a multitude of fronts, that's just fascinating. One, from how the project came about, BJA realizing, because I remember those solicitations, and it's city specific. Of if we think about even when RCT is tossed in, like it used to be quite a bit, that means something very different in a rural community itself. Let alone, do they have? I always went to where I went to high school. They had a Casey's gas station convenience store. That was it. They were like no more, no less. My graduating class was, I think, 68 students, kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
So it was small, but I think through those communities itself, and there isn't much. When you say to lure them away and have anything else but public transit, if it's trying to pick them up to do a program or anything, it's incredibly difficult. And that's where I can only imagine thinking through almost like it's almost like a decision tree. Like, can we do this? No, what about this? And it kind of bounces back and forth to see what is feasible, but it's desperately needed. And that's where there was a book that I was reading. I tried to find it before this, of how it almost takes generations in terms of decades of what's common and what's accepted from, say, norms itself in urban cities to then trickle outwards to suburbans, the outskirts, to then rural areas of. There is a generational difference with that as well, to where when we think through programming and what could lure them away or what be attractive, it's very different in some of those situations, especially when you're talking about a community that you're working in and thinking through, is it relatable to a Seattle in the sense of experiencing that? Did you find yourself thinking through, or did you have conversations about it from a programming angle, like say youth, like what they would be interested in, given that's the norm of what they were doing, which I understand that, but what else would even be possible at that time point?
Yeah, and that's where, again, like a lot of the qualitative work that we did came in really useful. We did qualitative interviews for that BJA project. And then the monograph that I've just finished working on is based on a different set of qualitative interviews that I did with a Andrew Carnegie Fellowship that kind of built off what we learned. But I think that one of the things that was really interesting was that the majority of what was available for kids was kind of sports based, right? The football team or the basketball team. And that was great, except that there were a lot of kids who didn't want to do sports or couldn't do sports, right? And that wasn't appealing to them. And there was nothing like a movie theater or, like I said before, a community center or anything like that. Very minimal things that were available. But one of the things that really came through strongly in both sets of interviews was just kind of the really deep cultural links in Appalachia specifically, in Appalachian Kentucky, to their heritage of music and art and theater and that kind of thing. And we identified a lot of opportunities where kids really wanted to connect to that. They really saw the importance of, they had seen their their dads and their granddads working in the coal mines, and they were aware of that history of, there's all these protest songs that are connected to the struggle of the coal miners against the big businesses and the unions against the law enforcement, and they were so connected to that history, and they really wanted to tap into that and to make music and to process a lot of the trauma that they were experiencing from just the economic decline, the collapse of the coal industry, the opioid crisis that was hitting really hard. And not just opioids, but meth as well was really significant in that area. And a lot of the kids that we connected with were part of these theatre groups where they would actually put on these plays that would really tap into some of these challenges that the community was facing and give them ways to work through it and to think about solutions and to think about lifting up the community. So I saw a lot of opportunity there for just sort of art and cultural expression. And the kids were so interested in opportunities to do more of that, right?
No, it's fascinating to hear that too, especially for that area. I mean, and I'm glad you brought up and kind of hit on, especially that region of the U.S. with the opioids and meth and everything from the changeover of that. Now, when you think through your rural research and kind of where you want to take it, and as you even had the BJA meeting of, there's limited even research out there that we know of right now from even a place perspective. Where do you think some of the future needs to head as you think through like what is next or what should focus on, what should be considered? Where do you think that is heading or should head?
Yeah, I do think that we need more basic research on rural crime concentration. I have some things in the fire in terms of wanting to do a bit more around that, but I know that other people are working on that as well. And I'm seeing a few more things coming out. And I think the challenge is that, street segments are sort of one of the key ways that we make sense of crime concentration, microplaces. And I'm not sure that necessarily makes sense in a rural community. So the question is, what does make sense, right? And is it sort of an arbitrary measure of the unit, or is it more sort of tied into the specific nature of the area, which is really hard because rural is not a monolith. What we see in Appalachian Kentucky is not the same as a rural area in like Oklahoma or Utah.
You can say Arkansas, it's fine.
Well, yeah, there's a few down there too. But yeah, just geographically and culturally, there are so many differences. So yeah, I'm not sure of the answer to this. And I think there's a lot of people who are way smarter than I am in terms of the sort of statistical side who are thinking about this. And definitely something that I'm planning to look into more now that the qualitative piece is done. But I really think that it would be helpful to have a better understanding of that, because one of the challenges that we saw when we tried to do the street segment analysis in Kentucky was kind of obviously crime is just concentrating largely where people are spending the most time, right? It's not necessarily that there are more crime opportunities. I mean, there are crime opportunities there, but largely it's just because these places are crime generators, right? Like people are converging at the Walmart because they're coming from just dotted all over the county and they're all coming together there. And so it's not necessarily, I mean, yes, there are opportunities to commit crime at Walmart, but do you know what I'm saying? It's really hard to sort of make sense of how do we respond to that when a lot of it is just the sheer number of people in a given place?
Oh, fully. It's spatial ambiguity at that level. I think about, and I was shocked by this in the same analogy you gave there. I was in Montana. I used to do some work in rural suicide prevention. And Walmart there was used as a hub for like the counties around. So when you think about who is coming there, and we think about the impact a crime generator or attractor has on an environment in a rural area, that is starkly different of the impact it has. It's no longer the 3 to 4 blocks that we want to measure in an urban community. It's miles upon miles, given there's no other opportunity for shopping or retail really in general. So you are very limited, but there's still the convergence, but it looks very different. And I'm even thinking about, because we've had conversations internal to CAP as we collect more rural data, concentration looks different. Like how you think about it should not be the same, let alone, I'm not going to bring up the suburban definition, because what is suburbia? But from urban to rural, like there is stark differences, and there like consistency is nice because then you can compare across studies and that. But to your point, the rural nature of, say, Arkansas to Kentucky, it's different. I think you find probably more commonalities in how urban development happens within cities, just block length and that kind of stuff. But rural areas is a little different with that. So it is an interesting research question to dive into, and has my mind kind of bouncing around with ideas now just to test. But I think it is a big area that as we become more data forward with smaller agencies, the ability to look at this from a quant heavy perspective, I think will open up some avenues as well. We'll probably just at the same time need more time to have enough data to what is hot or what is a lot or what is a concentration. Because in some of these, is it 2 to 3 of a crime type? That's a lot for even 2 to 3 years kind of thing. So it's a lot of questions that come up that are not used to in a lot of other crime in place research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as well, we need to know a lot more about how do we translate evidence-based policies and practices to these areas too.
Very much so.
Yeah, we did some work a few years ago with IACP. We put together a evidence-based policing sort of translational guide for small and rural agencies. And we did some really interesting focus groups with police chiefs and representatives from smaller departments. And there's so many just practical barriers to be able to do that kind of work. I remember talking to one police chief, and I forget the agency, but they had, I think it was him and maybe 2 other officers in the whole department. And so he's like, how do I send my people for training? Or, who's going to sit and write a grunt when somebody has to be covering the town at all times, right? Mm-hmm. How do I go off and go to a conference and learn more about this kind of thing? So just having the resources and the capacity to be able to implement some of these approaches is just really challenging for some of these smaller agencies. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I think that we really need to think about how we modify some of our practices, and then we have to evaluate them again, right? Because if we're changing things up, maybe they're going to work differently. Yep.
True. No, and that's the part of evidence-based. You have to build that out, which I'd love to hear. Now, a fun question to end it off with. When it comes to understanding of crime, what grinds your gears that you wish the average person just understood a bit better, be it criminal justice, crim, anything with it?
Could probably do a whole podcast just this. I will say this, and this may be a little controversial, but this kind of comes from the qualitative work that we did in Kentucky. I think that there is sometimes a tendency for people in the community to kind of other those who are involved in crime. There's this kind of like us and them mentality. And one of the things that we found in that research was that there are some really strong elements of collective efficacy and social cohesion in Appalachian Kentucky, which are all the kinds of things that typically in urban areas we see as being protective against crime, right? But there was kind of a dark side to it in these communities too, where if you went against these sort of shared values, particularly by being involved in crime or being involved in drugs, which was sort of the main issue, right? You were kind of cast out, right? You were not seen as worthy of, you were seen as not worthy of protection from those shared values and social cohesion. And there's a lot more to it, right? Like a lot of it was sort of the economic decline and the challenges that the community was facing that was kind of undermining that sense of safety. But I think, I believe that people need to be accountable for, what they've done. But I think that there's also so many other forces, right? Like whether it's structural factors or environmental factors, place-based factors that are impacting on people's decisions to behave in the way that they do. And so I think that there's a tendency to ascribe a lot of sort of individual moral failure to some of these actions when, yes, there may be some of that, but there's also these bigger picture issues that are driving some people into crime opportunities, right? So I think just sort of if people can be open-minded to the possibility that people can change, that people can be helped, that maybe the criminal justice system isn't always the optimal place that people can get that help, right? Like maybe
So,
it's more investment in mental health services or more investment in youth programs. So yeah, I think maybe a bit more balance there. And, it's not all one and it's not all the other, but how do we sort of balance holding people accountable with also recognizing the circumstances that might drive them into some of their life choices and investing in or voting for better services that can help support those people?
No, I love hearing that. I think that ties a lot of your conversation together with evidence-based policy, testing it, knowing what works, and as we move it across different communities. So I think that's a great endpoint to it. With that, I want to thank you for your time. I have a lot of thoughts now on rural crime that I honestly want to just geek out with, and I'm sure I'll email you about. But
yes, please do.
Dr. Gill, thank you very much. I love this conversation because rural crime does not get enough attention, let alone with the combination of crime and place with it all too. So again, thank you for being a guest on the podcast today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
Be sure to subscribe to Cap Index's YouTube page, @CapIndexCrimeRisk, and look for Geography of Crime on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in, because when it comes to crime, place always matters.